Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. On Election Day, we saw Republicans in the state solidify their control. However, nationwide, Democrat Joe Biden is the next president of the United States. I speak with political science professors Gibbs Knotts and Scott Huffman this week in South Carolina. Former Vice President Joe Biden became President-elect Joe Biden when he clinched the needed Electoral College votes to send him to the White House after he flipped back Wisconsin, Michigan, and the critical state of Pennsylvania on Saturday. President Donald Trump has not conceded and is citing outstanding lawsuits in several states on the baseless claims of voter fraud. Republicans and Democrats took to the airwaves this week to support Trump and also slam the president for holding up the transition process.
This is a contested election. The media doesn't decide who becomes president. If they did, you would never have a Republican president for forever.
Trump White House is doing, I think it's unbecoming of what this country is all about. You don't, I don't know why people seem to be hell-bent on destroying the fabric that's been holding this country together all these years.
Republican members of South Carolina's congressional delegation even held a press conference at the State House in support.
America needs to get it right because it is the integrity of our election system that's at stake. Regardless who is president, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, the integrity of our election system from this day forward is the most important thing we can focus on. Because Americans have to have confidence, and people around the world have to have confidence in the American electoral system when we're electing the President of the United States, members of Congress, United States senators, and all the way down to city councils and school boards.
Governor Henry McMaster, who stands by Trump, discussed what a future of working with the Biden White House might look like.
But South Carolina has a good relationship with leaders in Washington. Our senators have good relationships with people on both sides of the aisle. I think that whatever happens with this election, whatever happens with the next one, I think South Carolinians stand tall in Washington, and we're polite and we're courteous, and we'll continue to do that.
Senator Graham is also now focusing money and efforts to the Georgia Senate runoffs.
Bernie's America is on the ballot in Georgia. What we're trying to do is stop the most radical agenda in the history of American politics from being enacted, and Georgia stands in the way of socialism for America. So to my friends in Georgia, we've never needed you more. What you do on January the 5th will determine what America looks like. If you keep Senate in Republican hands, I will be the budget chairman. If we lose the Senate because Georgia got it wrong, Bernie Sanders will be chairman of the Budget Committee. That's about as big a difference as you can think of.
And President Donald Trump emerged from the White House Wednesday for his first public event since he lost the election, to honor veterans at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery on Veterans Day, a solemn reminder of those who fought to protect this country. And joining me now to further break down the election 2020 is Dr. Scott Huffman. He's a professor of political science at the Winthrop University, and also Gibbs Knotts. He's the dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the College of Charleston. Welcome back to both of you.
Thank you.
Great to see you guys. I know we're about a week past Election Day, Scott, so I want to kind of get your thoughts on where things stand in the country right now. We know where things are in the state, but obviously there's a lot of things going on nationwide. And I kind of want to see what you think about just how unique this situation is, where we have a president who is not conceding to a president-elect, obviously Joe Biden. Where do you see the country going? What are your thoughts on how we stand right now?
Yeah, it is completely unique. Clearly, the states where Trump was ahead last time and declared the winner were much more narrow than the size of Biden's victories in the states this time. And obviously the popular vote is overwhelming, but that's sort of not relevant. But the votes in all the states, and the problem, I think, for going forward is how this undermines the public's trust in government and trust in the legitimacy of the process. And so, we've seen that every time Trump, sends out a baseless claim of, there's, shenanigans going on in this state, or, there's something wrong with the ballot, it gets echoed and bounced around the Trumpian echo chamber, but then it begins to seep out. And even folks who are accepting of the final outcome will still say, okay, yeah, my guy Trump lost, but there was still some problems with it, when in fact there weren't. The observers in every state, international observers, said it was an extremely smooth process, which is a miracle during a pandemic. So I think in the long run, this is just going to continue to erode trust in government, trust in the legitimacy of the process, and it's just going to, continue to fuel both sides being so polarized.
Gabe, let's kind of jump in on that too and follow up about just, President-elect Joe Biden has to now face a divided country, even more so divided, especially when you have someone in the office who's not willing to acknowledge loss. How big of a challenge will this be for the incoming Biden administration to unite the country amid these circumstances?
I think it's going to be a big challenge. I mean, Joe Biden is probably perhaps better equipped than anybody to do that. He has a 4-decade history of reaching across the aisle. I mean, he was friends with Fritz Hollings and Strom Thurmond, two very different senators here in South Carolina. But it's a different era, it really is. I mean, post 2008, when Mitch McConnell pledged to make Barack Obama a one-term presidency and make it difficult to get legislative accomplishments done, it seems not to win the day to reach across the aisle. I mean, to me, on the positive side, Gavin, I mean, it was near record turnout. A lot of people participated. And, while we saw a lot of division, we also saw some areas that are becoming increasingly competitive. I mean, our neighboring state of Georgia, which has been a really strong Republican state, looks like if the recount holds, will be a state that Biden won. And then obviously the nation's attention is going to focus on Georgia on this, where Senate election, Senate control hangs in the balance with these two Georgia Senate contests.
Yeah, those runoffs, and we'll definitely get into how our state's looking when we look at our purple neighbors in a moment. But Scott, I want to touch with you really quick about polling. Obviously, you run the Winthrop poll, and I want to get your take on just how we saw polling shake out this presidential election year versus 2016, where a lot of people had a lot of heartache over, a lot of heartburn over. How do you see the polls and how they stacked up this year specifically? Maybe some of these swing states.
In 2016, obviously the national polls were spot on, but polls in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania were all off. They were only off by 3-4 percentage points, but they were consistently off in the same direction. The reason for that had to do with education. People with higher educations tend to report that they're going to vote more, so they make it into the poll, which is usually not a problem because they actually do vote more. Well, this time, people with less than a college education said, like they usually do, I may or may not vote. But in the end, they did vote. So that's why those polls lean consistently towards Hillary. So this time, people were weighting by education. Again, the national polls were good. Some polls that we thought weren't as great turned out to be okay. But we still see several that were 6-8 points off, and getting the direction right is good. But seeing that far off, and there's been a few theories floated that we're going to have to test, that the states that they tended to be off on, Michigan and Wisconsin, which still went for Biden, but not by as much, those were states where you have higher percentages of people who believe in the QAnon conspiracy stuff, which means it looks like they were less likely to take political polls. So that might have caused the undercount of Trump support there. So we're still going to be shaking this out for a few years to come.
And Scott, just to really quickly follow up on that, tell me about the challenges inherent with polling. You mentioned a little bit of that, people not reporting accurately as well, but also in light of the pandemic, how difficult is it to do this in the first place?
Yeah, so, basically we're down to about 10% response rate, 9 to 11% response rate, which is not a problem as long as there's no response bias, meaning if there's no difference in the people who are willing to take polls versus not willing to take polls. And in general, when it comes to surveys, not quick political polls, when it comes to surveys, there really is no non-response bias. However, when it comes to political polling, we're seeing in a couple of states, maybe there was, but the greater problem with political polling is how you select likely voters. Do you start with full RDD, random digit dial for cell phones? And of course, you have to include cell phones, which throws robopolls out. Full random digit dials. and then screen for registration and then screen for likelihood, or do you start with just a registered voter file and then do a screen for likely voters? And what is your screen for likely voters? So it's the sampling is always, completely scientifically verified, but different polling outfits kind of feel strongly one way or another about the best way to get likely voters. And that's why you end up seeing what's called a house effect from some polls that tend to lean one way or the other.
And of course, you still have to answer your phone. And if I don't have someone's phone number, I'm likely not answering the phone too. But I want to talk to Gibbs about, one poll, of course, one polling we did see really strongly, of course, back in February, were polls leading up to our presidential primary for Joe Biden. I want to rewind to just how critical South Carolina was for Joe Biden. You and your colleague, Jordan Ragusa, wrote the book on primaries in South Carolina. So I want to just ask you about just how big of a role that played. We know how it helped jumpstart his campaign, but what do you think it might result in going forward, especially if someone like maybe Jamie Harrison becomes DNC chairman, and what that might mean for the calendar in the future elections?
Right. Yeah. So we wrote a book, and our basic argument, Gavin, was that the South Carolina primary was important. And then, we got really lucky, because this time it really was even more important than we ever imagined for Joe Biden. And so, I think it's obviously critical. It's important for the Democrats in a different way that it's important for the Republicans. For the Democrats, it brings diversity to those 4 early states. Iowa and New Hampshire in particular are not very diverse states when it comes to race in particular. And so, it's a first opportunity for the candidates to go and test themselves with a voting population that's at least 50% African American. It's also a little more conservative electorate than some of these other places. And so it was just tailor-made for somebody like Joe Biden, and I think had a huge impact. We're bullish on the South Carolina primary, and we certainly realize there's other ways you could select your presidential nominee. You could have a national primary, you could have regional primaries, but if you're going to pick early states, and we think there's some advantages to doing that, we really argue that South Carolina is a really, really good state to go with. It's very representative on the Republican side of the national Republican electorate. And on the Democratic side, as I mentioned, it brings that much needed diversity. So I certainly hope South Carolina stays as one of those early 4 states. It might even bump up, above Iowa and New Hampshire, given some of the criticism of Iowa and New Hampshire. Also, I think caucuses are, people are less excited than ever about caucuses after what happened in Iowa. So I'd expect a few more primaries and a few less caucuses this time.
Yeah, something definitely remains to be seen there, especially at the Iowa fiasco with the county. That was just really kind of kicked off our year, didn't it? Scott, I want to switch to you. Before we get into statewide stuff, I want to wrap up with some national look here. Talking about potential moves for the Biden transition team right now. They have to make about 4,000 appointments. Obviously, the transition is still kind of stuck from the federal level. They're still moving forward. They're still waiting for the General Services Administration to ascertain that they have won the election, which is, short of any other broad-based claims that there's been voter fraud. It's pretty obvious that Biden has won this election. I want to get your thoughts about what that might mean for some prominent Democratic South Carolinians. Any idea about maybe some that we might see moving forward? I mean, in the past Trump administration, we did see Nikki Haley go to the UN. We saw Edward McMullen go and become a ambassador to Switzerland. What are your thoughts on maybe potential moves for some South Carolinians and if they want to make those moves?
I think that you will see some. Joe Biden, has made a big deal about his relationship with South Carolina, even before this primary season, because he knew if he jumped in, South Carolina would matter. With Jim Clyburn's endorsement, quite literally breathing life back into a mostly dead campaign, then I think South Carolina is going to get a lot of love from the Biden administration. The question is, how deep will they go? I expect to see, them digging deep. Obviously a few members of the House and Senate who are Democrats are unexpectedly out of a job. But I think that you'll see a good bit of the apparatus of the South Carolina Democratic Party kind of shuffling around. And South Carolina is poised, I think, once again, to get a nod from the administration and a few plum spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn saying that he's happy where he is, but again, we'll remains to be seen what might happen for some other Democrats in the state. Gibbs, I want to switch to our election night results. You were with me on election night. We were doing a remote hit there for our show. And a lot has changed over the week. A lot has shaken out. We've seen the results get certified here. I want to ask you just both of you, but I want to start with Gibbs first. Just, what jumped out at you from those results? Some big takeaways for you from election night 2020.
So we saw, Gavin, so many polls that showed a close election, a potentially close election between Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham. And in the end, it wasn't really that close. And to me, it was just a reminder of some of the underlying fundamentals in South Carolina. Somewhere around 47% of folks in the exit poll said they were conservative. I think 42% said they identify with the Republican Party. I mean, that's difficult for any Democrat to get elected statewide. It's just, it's a state that's set up for Republicans. Every statewide elected official is currently a Republican. Obviously, Lindsey Graham continued that. Doesn't mean a Democrat can't win, and we're seeing some examples in some surrounding states. But it's a tall order in this state, given the conservative nature of our electorate and the partisan identification and favorability towards the Republican Party in our electorate.
And we'll definitely drill down into that stuff in a moment. But Scott, I want to ask you just about what jumped out to you with those results last Tuesday.
Well, Gibbs nailed it, just how much it all went back to standard expectations. The first congressional district was solidly Republican. It was a fluke that turned it Democratic last time. And so this was more or less a return to the norm. Statewide, when we talk about South Carolina, we say, South Carolina is an R+10 state where generic Republican, generic Democrat, the Republican wins by 10 points. And that's sort of what the election shifted back to, especially with Lindsey Graham. I do think that a lot of the things that drove Republicans in the last couple of weeks to come out and conservatives to come out, obviously they weren't deciding who to vote for. I think they were deciding whether or not they were going to make the extra effort to come out. And between, Trump's exhortation that they, show up on the day of election and the hope and the expectation shown by South Carolina Democrats, nothing's going to drive a South Carolina Republican to the polls like seeing hope in the eyes of a South Carolina Democrat. So, I think that had a lot to do with it.
And Gibbs, just to kind of continue on with that, we saw the nationalization of that Senate race, of course, as well. We saw a lot of, attempts to tie Jamie Harrison to these national politics. How big of a role do you think that also played in that race specifically?
I think the nationalization of the race was huge, and I think it affected both, Graham's strong showing and Harrison's weaker showing. I mean, look, Graham looks like a genius. He basically got about the same percent statewide as Donald Trump did. People were scratching their heads, wondering why he's so connected. And again, at least in this state, certainly not nationally, but in this state, Donald Trump remains fairly popular and did fairly well, in a head-to-head against Joe Biden. Likewise, I mean, it's just, Jamie Harrison has a great biography. He obviously has the money, but if he's getting just nailed over and over as somebody who's, Nancy Pelosi's best friend, somebody who, is a socialist, again, certainly he doesn't advocate any of those policies, but if it's inundating the airwaves with that message, it makes it really, really difficult. He never really got out, I think, and was able to say exactly what he was for in a way. Obviously, he just got defined by the Republicans with the amount of money that they were able to bring in and do this race. And so just made what was already a difficult task even more difficult.
Yeah, Scott, let's stick with the Senate race for a moment there. Jamie Harrison was pretty much printing money. Had historic fundraising, the likes that no one has ever seen in a Senate race. I'm sure that might change when Georgia starts heating up even more. But, we did see in the end, Graham won by 10 points. Now, that's about 7 points less than he won in 2014. Obviously, different year, different election. But with all that money, Democrats still had problems with messaging, which is something that they always said, once we have money, we can probably try and attract more people. I'm just wondering, what do you think this means for the state Democratic Party if you spend $120+ million and you still only get within 10 points of, a statewide race with a Republican there?
Well, let me go back to something you said, 2014, different year, different, race. And it was also a different Lindsey Graham. Back then, Lindsey Graham was the least popular Republican among Republicans. Up until the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, among Republicans, his approval rating was only in the 50s compared to upper 70s and 80s for Nikki Haley and Tim Scott. So when he became Trump's pit bull, the sort of dislike of him among conservative Republicans, the ones who used to call him Grahamnesty, sort of shuffled away. And they were more likely to say, yes, this is the Graham I want, the one who stands up for Trump, the one who's going to push through, go back on his word and push through conservative Supreme Court nominees. And so that excitement, as Gibbs pointed out, the nationalization of the race, Jamie Harrison ran a near perfect race. He got tons of outside money, which most Democratic candidates in South Carolina running against Lindsey Graham, all Democratic candidates other than Jamie, have not been able to do. He started the race focusing on South Carolina issues and tried to do that, not bring up Trump. He did his best not to nationalize the race, but the forces nationalizing it and the messages from Trump really tapping into the perceived threat of a lot of moderate and conservative folks to get him out. It was just too much for Harrison's campaign to overcome in the end.
And then, Gibbs, before we move on to the 1st Congressional District, I want to ask you about just how big of a role that vacancy on the Supreme Court played for Lindsey Graham's reelection. That happened, we saw the loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in mid-September, and then we saw the confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett in mid-October. One of those days during the hearings, Graham said that he raised about $5 million just for holding those hearings in his Judiciary Committee. So I'm wondering, when we look back, when we dissect this, that Supreme Court justice vacancy was a huge moment, I would say, maybe for this campaign.
I think so, and certainly nothing Lindsey Graham could have planned, but it allowed him to raise money to be able to. He didn't match Jamie Harrison, but he was able to be competitive, and I think it reminded conservatives, why they support people like Lindsey Graham. It was an example of, look, we might not agree on all policies, we might not agree with the president, but we're really happy with the judges, and the judges are Trump making the nominations and the Senate confirming. And so Lindsey Graham really shepherded that process through. It was, really successful. It was not easy, but really impressive and successful that he was able to get that through. And I think that only helped him in the Senate election.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, I want to talk to you about demographics in the state. Obviously, we're talking about a tight Senate race over in Georgia, possibly them calling the presidency for Biden over there too. And then we look in the North Carolina, obviously shifting demographics there too, tightening races. But what's going on in South Carolina? We do see a lot of transplants. We see a lot of people moving here, but looks like, when it comes to our politics, they're holding steady like you've been mentioning.
Yeah, it sort of is tending to reinforce what we have. Some research that Gibbs and I have worked on together with some other of our colleagues looked at, native Southerners and how they behave versus non-Southerners who live down here versus people who call themselves converted Southerners. And those converted Southerners are those folks kind of moving in, retiring, say, from New York or Ohio. And what they're bringing down is a kind of native conservatism that looks more like national conservatism when they retire. So while demographics are changing the racial makeup of South Carolina, we're going to see an increase in Hispanics and Latino in this census. It's also in a way reinforcing the existing ideology in the state, and that is helping the sort of the conservative message weather multiple iterations of the McCain conservative message to the Mitt Romney conservative message to the Trump message. And that evolution is staying and keeping South Carolina as conservative as ever, even if the conservatism is changing and evolving on its own.
And with about 1 minute left, Gibbs, we did see some evolution, especially down that first congressional district, your neck of the woods. Tell me about the factors at play there and how we saw a Republican flip that seat back to Republican control that they lost in 2018.
Yeah, so in 2016, Trump won the district by 13 percentage points. Joe Cunningham comes back in 2018, is able to wrestle the district away and turn it blue. But, you know, he was running without a popular Republican president on the ticket. I think that was really too much, just in the way the Senate race got nationalized. I think having Donald Trump atop the ticket probably helped out Nancy Mace. It was extremely close, as it was in 2018, but ultimately, you know, that flipped back kind of to the way the underlying fundamentals. Again, the Republicans in Columbia drew it up to be a Republican district, and it was back in Republican hands this time around.
Yeah, we got redistricting coming up too and a lot more issues to look into. But I appreciate y'all's time for breaking down more about what we saw last Tuesday. That's Dr. Scott Huffman and Dean Gibbs-Knotts. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin.
To stay up to date with the latest news, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a podcast that I host that drops multiple times a week. You can find that wherever you find podcasts or on southcarolinapublicradio.org. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.